Now, even before we get started, I think that's really interesting. Why is that a rite of passage of translating uh, that particular document?
Well, Jonah is short, right? You think about all of the books in the Hebrew Bible. Jonah is a narrative, which is much easier to follow, especially for first-year Hebrew students. And it's short enough that you can get through it with beginning Hebrew students. And so, of course, Jonah chapter 2 is poetry, and that always trips up students once you get there, because poetry is quite a bit more complex to translate. But it just seems like everybody, and I've done it when I've taught Hebrew now, everybody goes to Jonah because it just kind of fits what you need.
I'm terrible at languages. I mean, I'm appalling at them. Is Hebrew difficult to learn?
Well, it's not difficult compared to many other ancient languages. It's a little bit simpler than many of the Indo-European languages. And so it's much less complex than Greek or Latin, for example. There are some, features of Hebrew that take particularly English speakers, and that's the context in which I've taught Hebrew the most. They just seem to have a little bit more difficulty, getting into that kind of frame of thought. But in general, I tell people all the time that Hebrew is definitely easier than Greek, because we have a lot of majors at Baylor, and they're trying to decide, should I take Greek or should I take Hebrew? They only have time to take one in their courses, and I say, well, Hebrew's easier. So
that probably wins a lot of converts right there.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I've heard that Greek is fairly difficult. It has very complex grammar and syntax or something.
Yes, Greek does have a pretty complex syntax, particularly the verbs are very complex. The nouns are not simple themselves, but the verbs are they can take so many different forms, and there's little nuances with the verbs and participles. Yes, it's quite complex.
Yeah. And you also know Ge'ez. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, Ge'ez.
Ge'ez.
Yes, it is. That's Ethiopic for your listeners.
Yeah.
It is not what is spoken in Ethiopia today. Today they speak Amharic, and Amharic is a descendant of Ge'ez. And so there are still some similarities, but when I see an Ethiopian restaurant or that sort of thing, I can't necessarily read the menu.
Okay. Now, are there, because their holy books are written in Ge'ez, aren't they?
Oh yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Now, are there many living speakers of Ge'ez? I mean, could an average Ethiopian who speaks Amharic pick up one of his own sacred books and be able to read it?
Yeah, they could, because it's the liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church still. So you go in Ethiopia, you go to an Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and the readings will be in Ge'ez and that sort of thing. So there are plenty, especially if you go to the clergy will know it much better than the laity, but even some laity would be able to understand decently well.
Okay. So it's not like in medieval Europe where the clergy are reading in Latin. And none of the congregation actually understands a word they're saying.
I think it's a little bit closer, though, of course, depends on what era of medieval Europe you're talking about. Latin was pretty close at some points of medieval Europe, but it's a good analogy.
That was an element that Garry and I were talking about the last episode, is that there's a literary quality to all of these books that we completely miss, at least in our translations of the Bible, reading them in English. What are some of the poetic and the literary qualities of some of these books in Hebrew that don't translate through to English?
Well, the easiest one to, it doesn't translate, is Nahum opens with an acrostic hymn. And this is not widely known. Of course, for your listeners who may not know an acrostic hymn, it's the first line of each of the line. The first letter of each of the lines corresponds to a letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And the correct order. The most famous acrostic is Psalm 119, and that's normally noted in most English Bibles. Most of the acrostics in the Hebrew Bible are not noted in English Bibles, but Nahum opens with this acrostic, and it finishes kind of only halfway through the alphabet. It doesn't go through the end, which people puzzled for a long time is why did it cut off here? But there's a lot of language, a lot of wordplay in Nahum, which is always difficult to translate. Lots of uses of rich metaphors. Of course, those come through a little bit more clearly. One of my favorite parts is kind of the end of Nahum 2, where the metaphor keeps switching between lions and then the actual army of the Assyrians, and rich use of metaphors all throughout. Also has very vivid poetry that, when it talks about the chariot wheels rattling, you can just hear the armies pouring through the gates of Nineveh and sacking the city. So it is very high quality stuff. Some of it translates, but you're right, quite a bit of it will not.
What was it like when you finally learned enough Hebrew to really understand that poetic quality? Did it really explode of how well you understood these texts?
Well, yes and no. It's, it gives you a greater appreciation for the text. Our English translations, most of them are decent, some of them aren't, but, and so one of the things about Hebrew, though, is it is a pretty vague language. And so my students, I tell them kind of the first day of class when I'm teaching Hebrew is when you're learning, these languages, you expect us to be able to understand it so clearly and so perfectly. But the ambiguity of Hebrew means that actually a lot of times it's less clear when you read it in Hebrew than when you do in English. Of course, the translators have supplied their own interpretation, translation, but a lot of times it can be quite vague. And you have to be a little bit vague in order for wordplay to work, right? You have to kind of massage things just so. But yeah, it really does bring out, the literary quality of these books is a lot easier to appreciate when you're reading Hebrew, because you're right, that just doesn't translate well.
No, I was just going to say, I always keep getting Zechariah and Zephaniah confused as to which one's which. No and worries. Actually, I'd forgotten, and thanks for reminding me, about the sort of the proto-apocalyptic bits
Yeah.
at the end of Zechariah. Now, actually, you reading the book in Hebrew, does it look like it's actually Zechariah is actually two books mashed together?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Okay.
It's a radical change between Zechariah. There's quite a fault line, you could say, between Zechariah 8 and Zechariah 9.
Yeah. So Daniel's got the same fault line in it too, hasn't it?
Daniel's got quite a few issues. It changes languages.
That's right, it changes languages.
Yeah. And then it changes back. Yes, and narratively, if you're just reading an English version of Daniel, the fault line feels like between 6 and 7, right? Because that's when you switch from narrative to these apocalyptic visions. And but the chapter 7 in Daniel is still in Aramaic, and so you pick up Aramaic in chapter 2 and you go all the way through. It doesn't feel to me, other than the fact that it's a different language, as different in a lot of ways as Zechariah does between the two portions of Zechariah.
Oh,
I could imagine that there was there was probably some coherence in terms of author across the sections of Daniel. But Zechariah seems, in fact, some people have even gone as far to say that Zechariah 9 through 14 really should be a different book. And if you go and pick up commentaries on the Book of the 12, you'll find a volume very commonly that's a Haggai, Zechariah 1 through 8 commentary. And then you'll find a Zechariah 9 through 14 commentary.
Okay.
Because they're so different. Zechariah 1 through 8 really has more in common with Haggai than it does with 9 through 14.
Where do these where does the genre come from?
Yeah, well, it's something that develops over time, as everything does, right? And there's kind of a big joke is that nobody can quite define apocalyptic because, but we know it when we see it, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Apocalyptic, you have some early elements of what we would call apocalyptic literature in Isaiah. And then really you get to Ezekiel, and that's when things are really headed towards that typical apocalyptic genre. Ezekiel has this intermediary angel that kind of explains the visions to him and that sort of thing. That's kind of a hallmark of the apocalyptic genre. Zechariah gets this too. Occasionally there's somebody explaining Zechariah's visions to him as well. Then Daniel, this is the full-blown more apocalypse, much more akin to Revelation. Full-blown, numbers everywhere that make no sense, except that they're symbolic in some sense. It does seem to be a Jewish thing that Christians picked up on. There are quite a few Christian apocalypses in the early few centuries of Christianity. Of course, one of them ended up in the canon of the New Testament, which is, of course, Revelation or the Apocalypse of John.
Traditionally, since those were documents that were meant to be read, was there any sort of notation on how the reader was supposed to enunciate or, basically use that text to preach it, for a lack of a better word, but to, enunciate that text?
Mm-hmm. Not in ancient times. We're doing good just to have things written down, which there's actually been quite a bit of work done recently on how texts actually probably served as memory cues. These were not highly literate people, but they probably had the text memorized mostly, and the text actually kept them on track. And so in a lot of ways, the text itself is a notation about how to read it. There are a few interesting texts. I don't think that any of these appear for the 12, but I'd have to go back and look. There's a few scrolls from the Dead Sea Scrolls that actually do have a system of notations for how you're supposed to emphasize various words and inflect. It's called stachography. And we have several of these texts for the Psalms. It gives you kind of clues how you're supposed to read, not just what you're supposed to read. One of the interesting things is that you have actually multiple copies of a couple Psalms and they're intoned differently. So they had different traditions about how to read. Garry, I was surprised that it had Naharim in the version you were reading there.
I'll show. I use the.
Of course. Oh, yeah. You mentioned that in one of the. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is the translation by the Jewish Publication Society.
Yes. Mm-hmm. They've done a good job there, at least trying to.
Yeah, and I love their commentary.
Mm-hmm.
They have masses of commentary. So, actually, have you ever read the any of the translations by Rabbi Everett Fox?
No, I haven't. I heard you mention that in one of the podcasts.
Oh, right. Yeah, he's only gotten up to Joshua, I think, and he's been doing it for 20 years.
Yeah,
and his translations stand out as very different from most English translations. And I've read that a lot of Hebrew scholars are surprised that he managed to capture so much Hebrewness.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to check him out.
Yeah, they're what's what? Poetic isn't the right word. It's yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just thought I'd mention.
Yeah, Robert Alter has also produced.
No.
Are you familiar with Robert Alter?
No.
Robert Alter is also a Jewish individual who has worked really hard. He's actually just recently finished translating the entire Hebrew Bible and into English, and it took him quite a long time as well. He's done a wonderful job. He also has some of his commentary along the way, and he does also try to capture as much of the sense of the Hebrew as possible. Yeah. But he's a literary critic by training, and so he's really good at bringing out the literary nature of things.
Were there any prophets that were considered for the 12 or written in a similar format to the 12 that just didn't quite make it in?
That's a good question. Probably, but they probably didn't survive. When you're dealing with a literary culture that's, it's somewhat limited in what it can produce, things that aren't as important, they just don't get recopied. And so you have a variety of kind of prophetic pieces that come out of that time frame, or a little bit later we have that didn't make it into the Hebrew canon. Things like the Book of Enoch, they kind of have a similar prophetic type. I don't think there was never any discussion, as far as I'm aware, that they might be included in the 12. But there were a variety of things that do exist that are kind of similar, but I don't know about how any of those could have been included. That would be an interesting conversation if you could go back to the 3rd century BC and talk to a rabbi. It's like, what was your logic in this?
Yeah, I mean, for all we know, there were dozens of these things floating around.
Oh, yeah.
Weren't they? And then the others just got lost. They weren't copied. Forget about them.
Yeah, absolutely. There's lots of prophetic figures that are referred to, especially in Jeremiah. Jeremiah refers to a lot of these other prophetic figures, and you have to assume that some of them wrote something down, but it just wasn't maintained. It wasn't transmitted.
Another quick question about the literary value before we move on to some more prophets is we're talking about a really large span of time here, but as far as the literary culture and the literary sophistication of the way these books are written, how does it rank maybe towards their neighbors and other highly literate cultures at that time, gauging that is a big time span?
Right. Well, a prophetic book is something of an anomaly. It's not totally strange in the ancient world, but the ancient Israelites seem to be more into producing these things called prophetic books than anyone else, for that matter. We've got lots of prophets that you run into in other literature, but not a lot of things that directly correlate to a prophetic book. It's easier to compare things like the Psalms. We have lots of Psalms, cultic kind of literature in other cultures similar. And they stack up well. They didn't have the resources of the mighty Assyrians, but they weren't just these podunk Israelites that couldn't spell. They stack up decently well in literary quality. Of course, a lot of these texts were produced over quite some time. And so you have the literary quality is augmented by successive authors being able to understand and add to the literary nature of the text as well. Similar to how some people view Shakespeare as really was a collaboration of a bunch of people. That might be the case in terms of any of the prophets, but especially in the 12.
You've been mentioning a little bit about what people think on these editorial decisions. Is this all academics in the modern era with this, or is there any contemporary commentary about editing decisions?
You mean contemporary to
the 12, or like closer to their time period?
Right. Well, you do have a few little hints that this is happening in the texts themselves. For example, Jeremiah, I believe it's Jeremiah 36, talks about the original scroll of Jeremiah being destroyed. And so Jeremiah tells Baruch, all right, we got to start over. And there's a little phrase there that says, and Baruch added many other similar words. So kind of giving you a hint that there was this editorial process that's going on. Of course, that's not the 12. We don't have anything that talks about editorial decisions. It'd be wonderful if we did. Contemporary to like forming the 12, we have to kind of deduce these things from, like I mentioned, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls says Jonah last. And also it'd be really very difficult to include some of the meta structure to the 12 without an editorial hand coming through to make it work that way. So not a lot in terms of contemporary. You do have, not in the 12, but this comes into play in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, different levels of editing between the Greek version and the Hebrew version. So the Hebrew version of Jeremiah and Ezekiel are each longer than the Greek version. And it's not that they have more chapters, it's that each chapter has these little additions. And they're totally logical additions. For example, in Jeremiah 7, in the Greek version, Jeremiah just launches into his famous temple sermon. In the Hebrew version, there's a little parenthetical note that says, Jeremiah went to the temple and preached these things, in essence, or prophesied these things. So they're little explanatory notes that somebody thought you needed in order to fully understand the text. And in that, this is not true in every case. In both the Jeremiah and Ezekiel, it's fairly likely that the Greek version preserves a less edited version of the text, because we also have they're fragmentary in form, but in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there is a Hebrew version of Jeremiah that seems to fit the Greek, follows the Greek ordering and length and that sort of thing, as opposed to the Hebrew. So ostensibly, the Greek goes back to a Hebrew version that was shorter than the Hebrew version that we have.
Wrapping it all up, it really seems that there were certain elements of the 12 that the Christians really latched onto, especially like I guess even that there was 12 of them. Was there a significance to that number 12?
I think that's probably why it stops at 12. Of course, you don't get to 12 till you get the last book, which historically speaking, Jonah was almost certainly the last one to be included into the 12. But of course, 12 tribes of Israel and 12 apostles, it's a significant number. But, it kind of, once you got to 12 books, it probably served as a nice length, because it is pretty similar in length as of a scroll to Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah. It's a little bit shorter than those other three altogether, but it's close to the length of those. And so 12 is a significant number. I don't think they just stopped because they got to 12. I mean, that's probably part of it, but also they probably couldn't fit much more on the scroll anyway.
Why do you say that Jonah, you think, was the last to be included as an editorial decision?
Yeah, so the book, well, there's a few things. The Jonah actually appears at the end of the Book of the 12 in some of the Dead Sea Scrolls manuscripts.
Oh, okay.
After Malachi. And so it doesn't get its position until a little bit later. It also, I think I mentioned how the 12 is kind of woven together, probably where you have the little things that connect ends of books to the beginning of the next. And Jonah seems to actually break the mold a little bit.
Oh, okay.
And in fact, some people have said you can connect Obadiah to Micah better than you can intend. So Jonah might actually be disrupting an original flow that was there. But of course, you're going to have a whole bunch of disagreement about that. Part of it stands in pretty strong opposition to Nahum, right? Think about how different Nahum is, because they come down basically on opposite stance on this area, right? So there's a variety of things that kind of lead in that direction.
Actually, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, a lot of these little prophets contain rants against Israel's enemies who shall be righteously destroyed. And Jonah is just out of left field.
Just maybe to wrap it up, what's maybe something that's really exciting that's kind of getting you out of bed in the morning in your studies that you can maybe whet the listeners' appetite with.
Are there any new academic theories popping out of the woodwork or reinterpretations happening, that sort of thing?
Absolutely. There are all kinds of reinterpretations. The thing in biblical scholarship right now is what we call ideological criticism. It's where you essentially you attune to some ideological perspective. So queer human hermeneutics pay attention to what the text says from the perspective of an LGBTQ person. Feminist criticism has been around a little bit longer, but paid more attention to the perspective of the women in the text and that sort of thing. This is fairly, I guess it's been around for about 20-ish years now. There's an increasing focus on ecological criticism. What does the text have to say about the ecological crisis that we're currently in? How is the land a factor in the text itself? And it is. The land plays a huge role in Hosea in particular, because the land suffers because of the sins of the people. You have that in Hosea 4. There's this connection between the sin of the people and the suffering of the land. And so those are kind of the new developments, the way biblical scholarship is going these days. There's a lot of work, and this is more classical biblical scholarship. There's a lot of work being done in trying to trace out the order in which the Book of the 12 came together. And so there's not a lot of consensus, but there's a significant consensus that the first form of the Book of the 12 was actually Amos, Hosea, Micah, and Zephaniah.